into this, but this is the exact presentation. I've emailed it to Dominic already. So
I'm close.
And this is very minimal. Most of the stuff I'm going to be doing is on demo, which is more or less going to be documented in this heavier piece of document. So we're going to be developing something, a very simple alerting workflow. It's important to note that SharePoint 2010 does come with alerting workflows. It's out of the box, it's free. But as with anything else, once you mature into that technology, you're going to say, geez, what if we could do this? What if we could customize that email? What if we could make that email do automated stuff, right? So that's really important to kind of keep in mind as you work with tools such as SharePoint or any type of system, or any other type of system. This design is purely educational. It's not something that I would put in production, but again, it's just very simple to get you an idea of what's happening there. Can you see that? This is really the alerting workflow that we're going to be using. So what I'm doing is when a new task is signed, is created inside SharePoint, we're going to kick off the workflow. So that's what we call a trigger. That's going to trigger the workflow to start. This workflow is going to say, okay, well, who was assigned this task? Email that person to let them know that, hey, you got a task assigned, so they don't have to keep checking all the time, and they get that in their mailbox, right? So it's a push rather than a pull type of service. And then wait for 7 days, or wait until 7 days before the due date to send a reminder email. If the reminder, or send a reminder email if it's not complete. So we're going to put some logic into this using SharePoint Designer 2010, and then at the very end, if it becomes 1 day late and the task is still not marked as complete, we're going to go ahead and notify. We're going to escalate this, notify not only the assignee but also the assignee supervisor. Any questions thus far? Cool. So I'm not starting on page 1. I've already kind of worked through up to page 9. So page 10, which is a lab 2. So we're going to start there. This is not a script for what I'm going to do. So please stop me if you have a question or you see something that confuses you. I mean, a lot of this is going to be confusing, but go ahead and let me know, and we could probably talk through some of that. So I've already created this SharePoint site. I've called it the project management site. And one of the things that you get when you create a new team site is you get this list. And it's important to kind of realize that SharePoint's architecture, it revolves around lists. They're just lists of items, just buckets really. So one of those buckets that you get for free is the task list, which you can use to assign tasks. So if I add a new item here, you're adding a new task. And you have different fields in here. So one of those is title, which is task name. Priority, status. We're going to be looking at the status one here, as well as start dates and due dates. And then the supervisor email, which I actually customized this particular out-of-the-box list to include the supervisor's email field, and that's covered in that first lab. That's what's going on there. So just kind of speed things along. I've already done that. So we're going to go straight into the SharePoint Designer 2010. The resolution on this thing. I don't have one here either. All I'm going to do is go ahead and log into my machine that has SharePoint Designer 2010. SharePoint Designer 2010 is, like I had mentioned, this is another application that allows you to work with kind of the internals of SharePoint. It's not a developer tool. It is designed for end users. But when I say end users, I really do mean power users. So just be mindful of that. Let me see.
Some of you, who's got SharePoint at work right now? So 4, 5, 6, 7. So, a number of you have got it, or you're aware that you've got it. If you don't know that you have it, you probably have it somewhere, but aren't aware of it. So some of the things he's showing you are things that, according to Microsoft, are things that an average user should be able able to do in SharePoint as of 2010. No longer should your IT staff be the only ones able to do this. Most of the permissions should be in your hands. You should be able to do it.
Yeah, and that's what we're trying to do even in the business school is, in the past, historically, we've always had to do everything for faculty and staff, right? And particularly faculty, they don't really know what they're doing. So we have to kind of step in and help them with stuff like website publishing and doing these type of tasks. So
Turning on the computer.
Turning on the computer, making sure the monitor's on, that type of thing.
Selecting the font in Word.
Yeah. Bolding. So that's...
I get those calls.
So, let me see if I can get this open. So SharePoint is a great way for us to...
Notice the URL he threw in there? He
Yeah.
just threw the URL of the site that he has rights to edit, and then he can control it. This software you can get. We have it on MSDNAA.
Yeah, in fact,
If you want, you can download and install it.
yeah, and I do have this is one of the later slides, I do have a link to the SharePoint Designer. This is a free tool, and this is all stuff you can actually do today, and the reason why I put my site on here is because you do have access to my site as a GPS student.
Right. So even if you don't have SharePoint at work, you actually, I think I showed this to you before, there's a My Site. Once you create, we can look at it again later today. If you want to play and try this stuff out, you can create your My Site on the GBS server and then connect SharePoint Designer to it and try out making a workflow.
Yeah. And hopefully I've documented all the steps in here. So I'm in SharePoint Designer 2010. I've already fast forwarded over to the Workflow Designer or Workflow Editor. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to this workflow, create a new one for the task. I'm going to give it a name. And best practice is to put a description, but... So, let's go ahead and start. And what it's doing now is communicating with that SharePoint server and saying, hey, I'm getting ready to create a new workflow. I require some other information in order to make this work. So, hand that over to me, and they do a lot of handshaking and talking and stuff. And now we're here. So the first thing I'm going to do is, based on my I want to notify the task assignee first. So, and then I also want to be able to wait until that 7 days prior, that 1 week prior, and then to send another notice at 1 day late, right? So as a developer, I'm going to do a couple things that may seem strange to you, but we're developers, so nobody really understands what we're doing. But what I'm going to first do is actually create some variables. And these variables are really just kind of storage places, right? So like in algebra, you assign a number to it. So instead of, in SharePoint Designer, I'm going to assign a couple days to it, right? And you'll see that in the actions, under actions, you'll have a lot of these different types of things that SharePoint can do for you. This is what we call automation, right? We wanted to do these things without human intervention. And there are places actually where you could ask a human, right, for some manual intervention, for directions, right, to what decision points is it approve or is it reject, that type of thing. But for now, we're actually going to create a new variable. We're going to add time to a date. And so what I'm actually going to do is think about this a little bit more convoluted, right? We don't want to know what 7 days from now. We want to know 7 days from the due date. So we're going to do something called a lookup. And again, this is all documented in your awesome training manuals. But let's go ahead and do a lookup. And that due date, remember when I pulled up that form, there was that due date field. So what we're doing is we're asking SharePoint to give us that item that we created, and to tell us what that due date was. So we're actually going to pull from the current item's due date field. And we're going to add -7 minutes, or 7 days to this. And we're output this. SharePoint does this awesome thing where it says, I'm going to help you out, I'm going to create new variables for you, but the word date really doesn't help me, because later you'll see, well, we're going to create another date, and we're going to have date and date one, and which one's the one we want to use. So I always, best practice is go ahead and create a new variable with a good name. So this is going to be 7 days, or I'll just go ahead and call it 1 week. 1 week from due. Okay. And I'm also going to create another one for that 1 day late. And we're going to do the same thing. And I'll call that new variable 1 day late. Okay. So that's our first step, is to create these variables. And what we're doing is we're just getting this kind of stuff out of the way. Because later we're going to need this anyway. So I'm just going to group those together and create these variables then. Yeah?
Just wanted to ask before I lose you. So basically this workflow, of course, is a collection of different tasks. And the first step, basically what you did is scheduling when the first task would start or the whole project would start.
Yeah, so the task list is built into SharePoint, and each task has a due date as one of its aspects.
Yeah. So
And that just comes with it.
Yeah, we're not necessarily saying, well, this is when the task is going to start. The task starts immediately, right? I mean, and you definitely could say, well, this task is going to happen sometime now, so you do have a start date field. So we could say start this a week early or work a week later. The idea being we have a predecessor that's coming up that needs to be due at that time, and there's dependency on those two tasks. So we could do that type of thing. In this particular case, I'm just alerting them. So what I want to do is have it so that in the 7 days, the 1 week prior, if that task isn't complete yet, I want to make sure that person knows. So I'm just going to send them another email. So we're doing 7 days before the due date. And then the other alert will be if the date, so if we have the due date and the date afterwards, we're going to check again. We're going to ask a workflow check to see if that task is complete, which is, yeah, it's going to be status. So status, if that's not marked as completed, we want to escalate that. So this is just purely a notification email. But you're absolutely correct. I mean, we could do things where we can make this workflow, build it out, and start saying, well, don't send this email out until the date starts, right? Or we can check to see, is the start date before today or today? Send it out. If not, wait until that day. So yeah, good question. So here we go. So we got this. We got our date set. We got our variables. And make sure I'm not missing any steps. Okay. Now we'll create another step. This one's going to be to generate the email text, right? And there are two variables that we're going to deal with there. So two types, what we call, we're just going to create two texts. The first one being the email subject line, and the other one being the email body. So we're going to build that stuff out in this one step as well. So in this case, I'm going to create another variable, right? So we're going to use a set workflow variable to value. And they love making this stuff sound really fancy and stuff because you can put this up in your resume and say, yeah, I know how to design workflows and stuff like that. And SharePoint is actually, I don't know what happened here, but Microsoft has made so much money off of SharePoint, not only because of the product, but the ecosystem. So there are countless number of consulting firms that have sprung up simply because of SharePoint. Purely because of SharePoint. And these are SharePoint consultants and SharePoint developers.
So what you're watching will cost your firm $500 an hour.
Yeah, it does. It literally does. We've gone through that here as well. So we're going to go ahead and set a workflow variable, and in this particular case, I'm going to call it email subject. And the project manager gets like $170 of that $500.
At least.
Yeah, they break that out. So we're going to create this. This is what we call string. String is just fancy word for text. So I'm going to create this email subject line. And what did I use here? So what I want this to happen is when somebody reads this to see this email pop up on their toast, the notification section of their operating system, they'll see, oh, there's a task, with the name of the task due on this day. So it's up front and center, it's in the subject line. They can see this on their phone or anything like that. So you always have to keep these things kind of in mind as you design these type of things. But what I'm going to do is say, I want this text to show up, and I want SharePoint to actually fill in the blanks. Right? So we have two blanks here, one between the double quotes, and that's going to be task name, and one over here, which is when it's due. So I'm going to go back over to the between the double quotes and add a lookup. I'm going to do another lookup here. And in our case, the task name is title. Keep in mind that task title is kind of by default, but you can actually rename this to task name if you want to customize that.
It looked like there was an option to put a link to.
Right, but yeah, you can put the link on there, but again, if you think about how email works, you'd never click on a subject link or a link inside a subject. It's always in the text or the body. So, and we're going to do another lookup, and we're going to do the same thing here with the due date, and we've already done this before. So we're good. So we got the subject line created and kept in this box called email subject. I'm also going to create another one now for the email body, and this one is a body. So same thing, this is still text, this is string. So, and then we're going to do the same process to kind of go through this. We're actually going to use a string builder, right? That's what those two that we've used here. And we'll go ahead and type this up. And this email totally sucks. All right, don't get me wrong. This is why it's not production quality. What's actually nice about this particular box, I know it doesn't look great to you, is it actually takes HTML. So if you ever gotten email from somebody like a really happy receptionist or secretary with purple and cats dancing around their emails, you can actually do that on here. Don't recommend it, not best practice, but you could. So I'll leave it at that. So what we're going to do here is put task name, task due, task priority, just to give you an example. And we're going to do the same thing with the task. We're going to use the current item for the task name. And then task priority. And while I'm here, let's talk about required fields. Right, if we go back to SharePoint and create this new task, you'll see that in this out-of-the-box task list, there's only one field required, title, right? And we're not really requiring any, we don't want predecessors. The status, the priority, start date, due dates, for supervisor, email, in fact, those don't have required fields. So SharePoint just says, well, we don't know if you need it or not. And we can actually go into modify this column. So let's say priority. And any other type of field. And we can actually go ahead and say, well, this actually does need to be required.
It doesn't have to be a unique value.
You can actually, yeah, this one particularly, you can actually use radio buttons and then select out which one you want select by default.
Column validation. I think it's at the bottom.
Oh, there it is. So you can actually write up these formulas to kind of make sure that it's within the values, because you only want
And not blank.
and not blank, right? You can do it not blank, but you can actually set the different priorities. So particularly so my old company, we had 0, 1, 2, 3 priority values. And so what we could do here is 1, 2, and 3 acceptable values. If you had a 0, escalate that because that's a 0 priority, or that's something that should have been done yesterday. So we actually build those, have business rules, the business logic into SharePoint, and have that check against SharePoint before anybody enters that. Or you can have other fields show up because you're going to require an escalation. So where I worked in healthcare, That's a patient safety issue. It's zero priority. It needs to be notified to leads and managers and possibly as a customer notification. So those are all logic things that you can actually build into SharePoint. So this email looks really good. I think he totally gets the point. All right, so we're going to say thanks. So we're good with our variables now. All right. So first thing on our task is to go ahead and email our assignee. So I'm going to send an email. Again, so you can't win here because send an email makes perfect sense. And so it's like, okay, well, that means send an email. So email these users. Okay, I just need to put user's name, then you put up this whole mailbox, and you got to go through this whole process again. Microsoft likes to make this really awesome for you guys. So we're going to go ahead and send this to the to field. This is where it starts getting a little bit more complicated. We're actually going to do something called workflow lookup for a user. Okay, we're not going to. These are all people I've emailed before apparently, and I don't think Amy needs to know that I got a task assigned to me. So I'm going to go ahead and use a workflow lookup, and we're going to use the current items assigned. Cool. Okay, that's good. So subject, we have that variable already pre-built, so we don't have to type this out again. So we'll do a lookup. This is where it starts getting a little hairy. So current item, that workflow variable that we created is not part of that current item. All right, so if we look at what was called email subject, email subject is not in that list. It's not part of that data source. So there's an awesome little thing here. Data source, it's not in there. We're actually going to be looking at the workflow variables and parameters. And this is why it's important to name your variables correctly, right? That cubbyhole, that bucket, needs to have a proper name. Otherwise, I could be picking date or date one. Don't know what those are, but I do know email subject. So go ahead and pop that in there. And we do the same thing for that body. Okay. So now we've emailed the current assigned to, so we're good, right? We've accomplished that first task of that process. Now what we want to do is tell SharePoint, all right, there's nothing else for you to do until the first notification. Thanks. So what we're going to do is something called pause. So we're going to pause until a date, and we're going to pause until, again, we're going to do this workflow variable lookup, and we're going to go to 1 week from due, right? So SharePoint does something called persistence. It just kind of goes to sleep until and wakes up on that date, which we've already calculated to be 7 days before that due date. So we're good here, right? We've paused it for 7 days. Now what we're going to do, our next step is when SharePoint wakes up. What are we going to tell SharePoint to do? And at this point, we're going to add another step.
Is this something that you are running at the client side or the server side?
This is server side. Yeah. So
Well, the software he's running
Oh,
is
the
on
software,
his
yeah.
machine,
Yeah.
but
Right.
it's connected to the server.
yeah,
So
the
it's going to
SharePoint,
store the workflow on the server.
yeah, SharePoint Designer is a client-side application. The workflow that I'm writing in here is running on the server side.
Yes. And storing on the server side.
Which is why SharePoint is kind of why I refer to that as operating system for business. Because if your computer, if this is running on my client and I turn it off, no workflows get processed, right? So this is running on our enterprise, always up, 24/7, never goes down, SharePoint site. So, no further ado. So now we're going to introduce the concept of logic. Because when it turns on, we don't want it to just say, well, I'm going to go ahead and email the assignee again. We want to make sure that the task has not been completed before we email them out. Otherwise, if it's completed, there's really nothing else for us to do. So we're going to tell SharePoint to check, to do a conditional statement here. And we're going to check if that completed field, which is the status, is completed, right? If the status is completed, all right, SharePoint, you're done. So we're going to go ahead and tell him, stop the workflow, right? And we're just going to log a message. Just so we know, if we were to debug this, if we were to go through the testing and say, well, why did that thing stop? we can actually put we'll be able to see the message in the history, the workflow history that says the task was completed, so we actually, by design, stopped it. Now, if it's not completed, then it's just going to ignore step 5 and move right on to step 6. So here we're going to do the same thing as we did in the previous step. We're going to send an email. And in this particular case, we're not escalating yet, so we're just going to copy what we just didn't duplicate what we did. Okay. So the email goes out. I'm going to tell it to go back to sleep again. So one more step to pause until the date. One day later. So SharePoint's going to go back. It's going to hibernate until that one day after. So even when the task is completed between that time, SharePoint's not actually going to do anything. It's not checking anything. We told it to just not do anything until that day, the day after. And the day after, we're going to wake up again, do the exact same thing here. We're going to check to see if that field is complete.
Can you just copy step 6 or step 5?
Yeah, you would think.
You can't?
You would think. Actually, I'll touch on that in a second. But not a SharePoint designer, which is awesome. So it says it's complete. We're going to do the same thing. Just kill the process or stop the workflow. And if still not finished, this is where we escalate. So we're going to go ahead and send the email again. But this time our to field is going to be a little bit different. So we're actually going to not look at the assign to. We're going to use this field that I created called supervisor's email. Right? Which is just to highlight the fact that, if we don't have the information that we need out of the box, it's very simple, right? It's only like first maybe 3 or 4 pages on here, and this is a large font. To add that new column, to add that field, to collect that data that we really need. And then we have the data validation, so we can make sure that certain values are enforced, that type of thing. And then take that field and then use it in a workflow, to use it as part of the business rules, as business logic, to drive that process. We're going to CC this guy because we don't want to do it behind his back. Assign to. And just for closure, go ahead and stop the workflow. That's it. Right? So we got those 10 steps, and I think there might be a couple steps I combined on the training manual. But this really drives, basically it's just telling SharePoint what to do. These are all things that a human could do, right? Every day, go check, see what's late, what's coming up in 7 days, and then email the guy, look at the supervisor, that type of stuff. You could have a human person do that, but that's just such a waste of resources. It's not scalable because imagine, 1, maybe 2 tasks. It's more likely to be in thousands, hundreds of tasks. You can just ask SharePoint to do this, to sit in place of that human and drive that business process. And you can even build more logic into this, right? So because SharePoint is a connected system, we could do things like, instead of using the supervisor email for us to enter that as part of that intake form, we could have it so that if you enter somebody's name on there, right, with assign to, have it check to see if that person is a true person, right? So we type in somebody's name. It validates to make sure that person does exist and that you didn't type in the name wrong, so that when the email goes out, it does go to that person. We can have SharePoint go out and find out based on HR directory, phone book, organizational chart, which could also be hosted on SharePoint, but it could be on a separate system. But to auto-populate that field so that the supervisor email is not necessary for to be manually entered. and then have that be used in the SharePoint workflow. We could even use this learning workflow, so instead of saying just email the current item and supervisor, we could create another task, an escalated task that goes out to the assigning supervisor, not just email him, but do something more active where it says, hey, your direct report has not completed this task, you must take additional action, or something like that. Those type of things. We could email to a different system, right? So there's different things you can do, and you can make it much more complicated than that. Yeah.
So SharePoint can do notifications and it can put certain logic around it to make
Oh,
it
yeah.
work. What else can it do?
So SharePoint has, let me hold off on that because it's a bigger topic. So let me,
What else can it do?
yeah.
How much money are you willing to spend?
No, I just want to find out what the secret is.
Yeah, let me hold off on that, and then let's make sure this is all. So are there any questions here on this particular workflow? Yeah.
So basically, this kind of task is the supporting task to your project that you have, right? Running with all the tasks that you have there.
Right.
So would that supporting workflow be good for MS projects as well as for other systems like Clarizen and like depends where the project is, right? Would that be
Sure.
compatible with any software?
So this is running on SharePoint, right? So there's two answers to that, right? As with anything coming from an MBA. Yes, it is compatible, but requires a lot of work. You could have, because SharePoint can act like what we call a middle layer. It could talk to Clarizen?
Yeah, you should introduce the idea of an enterprise workflow versus a specific site or list workflow. In other words,
Yeah.
could you reuse this workflow in another place, right?
Right, yeah. Yeah, that's true. And then that's also a big question, which is part of what I'll touch on with your answer. So you could have data feeding into this. You could actually have SharePoint workflows looking at other systems. If you've seen like RSS feeds, right, if you're familiar with that, there's other types of communication, so we call them web services and just different types of service buses, those type of things. A lot of applications today, enterprise class, have to have these type of hooks, and this will drive it. So yes, you could, but it's usually at great expense and a lot of effort. And then of course the other answer is no, because SharePoint itself, it has project server, it has what we alluded to, performance point for KPIs and metrics and dashboarding. So yeah, you could do best of breed if you wanted to with SharePoint, or you could just do homogeneous install and just run everything there.
And SharePoint is always an on-demand software, right? Like can't have it installed.
So SharePoint is not. So this particular SharePoint is our enterprise SharePoint license, which is it could be quite expensive. I'm not familiar with the corporate license for it. There is also a free version, but you lose a lot. You do lose a lot. So there's Windows SharePoint Foundations. It's very. I mean, if you don't have like a team of 10 developers, it's very hard to use. Yeah. So SharePoint does have a license, which you could actually use the MSDNA and download SharePoint and install on your laptop like nerds do, but I wouldn't recommend that.
So it's largely on the company server, right?
This is an enterprise server. Yes,
Okay.
this is an enterprise class server.
Because we use SharePoint for creating a website, let's say for supply chain or
Right.
procurement,
Yeah,
and we
right.
have various folders. But it's interesting to use it as a project management tool.
Yeah, so for example, I mean, this task list is on the server. The server has a definition that says every time you create a website on our server, you get a free task list. It's just part of the definition. Well, you can edit that definition. We can't. What we can't do is we can't edit the server's definition of the site, the server-wide site definition. But Dennis can. So you can call your IT staff and actually have for every task list, I want all these processes to be built in so that this alert workflow is always part of the task list on everybody's site, not just the one site, my site. See what I mean? See, he can do that. That makes it an enterprise workflow. This one we just created only modifies just my site, that one little site. But it could modify all of the task lists across all the sites. Could.
Yeah. I mean, there's one thing to drive the projects, right, that are kind of with your customers and those type of things. But SharePoint, or these workflows, you could have them self-managed, right? You could have the workflows manage SharePoint. So that so you could create a form, and it would be like student club form. And when a student submits a club, it will submit back to their sponsor to get approval. If it's approved, it comes to us, we hit approve button, and it goes out and provisions that site. So I don't have to go in there to site administration and provision that site manually, but I can provision that site on its own. So SharePoint could actually self-manage itself, right? It can be self-aware, totally take over the world, and do all that stuff, which it apparently has.
So like can you make Gantt chart and all that in this? Or
Yes. Actually, there is a Gantt chart.
There's that, yeah.
Yeah, so.
And if you install Project Server, which is an add-on to SharePoint, then you get a lot more, right? There's a simple Gantt chart built in, but you can get the full Microsoft Project, all of the tools of Microsoft Project as a web service, basically, once you install Project Server.
Yeah. So this task list actually has a Gantt view, so you can actually lay those different tasks out and see it on the Gantt chart.
But it's not a tracking Gantt.
Yeah, it's not for
But if you install Project Server, you can have a tracking Gantt in the web interface, for example.
Yeah, can you just interact with the MS project? Like say I have my entire project management thing set up in my MS project file, and it has all the tasks and all these things at very macro level. And if you want to set up such alerts for those tasks which I already set up in my MS project, do you think this can interact deeply from that project file and send the alerts?
For that purpose, they sell Project Server. And when you have Project Server, you can actually link your MS project on your machine to a Project Server project website, and it will sync bidirectionally.
Yeah, a lot of the project management tools, you really do need to leverage Project Server to do that. This does give you kind of like that teaser, just a little bit of a taste of what you could do. So you could, these tasks I add on here, which would trigger the workflows, you could export to project, so there's an export to project button here. And there is a way that you can use project to import.
But it doesn't sync bidirectionally automatically. Similar with Claris,
so before we get too far off track, just 2 more steps. I'm going to go ahead and save it. So what we're doing is we're saving this workflow back onto SharePoint, but it's still not live yet until I hit publish. So what this is nice because this publishing type workflow allows me to work on the SharePoint, work on this particular learning workflow, and make changes to it, test it out, see where it's going, because these workflows can be quite complicated. All the while, the current version of the workflow is already out there, it's doing its thing, it's not breaking anybody's stuff. So, just to make sure.
Does this thing automatically revision for workflows?
Yeah, it's versioning, yeah.
So you can go back to an old version.
Yeah. So here's our learning workflow, it's already running now. Since we're talking about 7 days out, I won't go through it, just because I don't want to risk it breaking on me. But that's pretty much the workflow stuff. So to get back to what else could SharePoint, well, let me see. Finish this real quick and then I'll touch on that. So SharePoint Designer, this is the link to where to get it. If you can memorize that, good. So, as I mentioned before,
I posted the slides. They've got it.
Yeah. And if you being SharePoint Designer 2010, or Google it. Continuous improvement. So like I mentioned before, this SharePoint workflow is not ready for prime time. We definitely need to work on it a little bit more. So we talked about populating a supervisor's email address from a disparate system. Customize individual emails, right? Right now, that email right now isn't even that great, but we could probably do things like make it red when it becomes late, or make it yellow, or well, not yellow, but make it a darker color, change the colors, add different text. We can do certain things like that in SharePoint, in that SharePoint Designer box like I mentioned with HTML. What I've done in the past is actually, with all my production-ready workflows, is I'll actually have a link in the email that allows the user, the reader of the email, to click on that link and get directly into the task so they can get the full information. And then data collection improvements, right? That intake form right now is just a generic form on SharePoint. So we can totally redesign this, add our company logo, make the branding a little better, and even add logic into the form so that it can help guide, right, like a wizard, how the data should be collected into this.
Now, on our server, the email server for receiving email is not turned on, but it can be turned on. So you can it could actually be set up so that someone with proper permissions can submit a task via email, and the workflow would start up.
Yeah, because everything is a list in SharePoint, and anything that's a list can have workflow running off of it. So in a lot of corporate settings, that feature is turned on, and you can email into SharePoint, and so those will be stored on a task list, could be stored on a support desk list, and then those will kick off workflows to kind of drive to start the workflow, the start process. So the other thing is, we talked about SharePoint 2010 and about so InfoPath is the other tool that we use a lot here in the business school. That's where all the forms are created. We use something called form services. That's just part of SharePoint. So those forms are actually driving the intake form rather than having SharePoint post this generic thing. So we can actually drive functionality in there. We can add a little more pizzazz into that. So that's InfoPath. Now back to the other couple of questions here is, if you look, we actually have Visio. And in SharePoint 2010, we can actually design workflows inside of Microsoft Visio, right, which is what a lot of people use for the business process management, seeing what the processes are, where they go, and a lot more of the complex stuff. And actually use that to design it rather than using this step 1, step 2 thing. So a lot of people like that interface over this, can't blame them. And that's how they kind of design this stuff. The more, yeah.
Can you view this in Visio?
You can't. Yeah. So this you can't.
That's the future.
Hopefully, that's what we requested for the last version. But what was I? So the Visio one is pretty cool because it allows some of your business users to start developing out those business processes. The other one, so moving from there, right? You see, this is a very sequential workflow, and unfortunately, in business and most things, sequential doesn't work. We actually want a workflow type called state machine, right? So because this is late, it just cancels, right? Or it starts off another workflow, that type of thing. State machine is more realistic. Well, it's late, so we're going to move into a late, and it's being handled by the workflow a little bit differently. Once it's changed status, let's change back to a different state, so it re-kicks a different workflow in different branches. So that type of workflow is much more robust. It can be mapped to more realistic processes. Unfortunately, it does require developers to come in, so we use a different tool called Visual Studio, and that's way outside the scope of this particular platform. Obviously outside the scope, but that is way in the developer space. So we do have different ways to up the complexity and to make it mimic the business process more efficiently, but they do require a little bit more of a learning curve as you move up on that scale. SharePoint, the other things that SharePoint can do, so we already talked about workflow. The workflows, again, this is built on code. If you know Visual Studio, if you know C#, .NET, these programming languages, you can do whatever you can in .NET and have it sitting on SharePoint. So information architecture, content management system, those are all built inside SharePoint. So this fancy term, information architecture, has been coming up a lot in the past, 5 to 10 years. And it's actually come up today. So I was in a meeting with marketing, and they want to keep track of different assets. Those different assets are, they want to have them manageable, and they could be producing about 25 different assets per month. And so the idea there is to have content types that we can organize these things, because a picture or a logo or a letter, we need to handle those differently, right? They have different types of metadata attached to them. A picture would have the people in the picture, whereas a letter may have a recipient that a picture may not. So those are different content types, and that starts building out what we call taxonomy, so we can help with enterprise search, knowledge bases, and be able to search through what knowledge the entire company has more efficiently. Is anybody doing this today? A few. In fact, Ferrari, Porsche, I think Kraft Foods, these websites are actually running on SharePoint, and their businesses do run on SharePoint. I think the statistic from Gartner was something around like 85-90% of the Fortune 500 or Fortune 200 is using SharePoint in some fashion. So it's certainly it's a maturing product, if not quite mature, but it still has a lot of growth potential, simply because of the fact it's not necessarily an application, but an application framework, a platform, so it's a development platform, and you can do a lot of different things with it. So that kind of give you an idea of where that can go, or you can see more specific.
There's some more capability. What else?
You can tie it to almost anything, because once you have the libraries, if you pay Microsoft Consulting enough, you can tie it directly to SAP and your ERP system. You can tie it directly to the control of specific physical robots. I mean, you could, theoretically, you can tie it to anything.
Yeah,
but the amount of money you'll have to pay to get that done is the daunting part.
Yeah, I mean, there's something called business connectivity services, which
Voice over IP, you can run that in here as well with the communications server.
Yeah, oh, here it is, data sources. So you can actually create data from data sources, right? We talked about lists and stuff like that. We can create database connections, services, REST connections, and XML, right? So a lot of services today, they spit out this format that can be read pretty much by anything called XML. So as long as your other systems can spit out XML or can read XML, you can communicate via that. Reporting is a huge so in Microsoft world, we use something called a database which has reporting services to generate really pretty graphs, make things really cool, and make people impressed. So that actually is hosted on SharePoint now. You can actually have SharePoint hosted on that so that only the right people can view certain reports, right? We're going through a process called security trimming. So, for example, Amanda might have rights to see this particular graph, but Tatiana doesn't. And we don't want to give them two different URLs to go look at this stuff. We just say, hey, go look at our reporting portal. They'll go to the reporting portal, and they will see only what they can see. So SharePoint already handles all that out of the box. Whereas before, you would have to kind of build that stuff out on your own or use other type of platforms. So all that's pretty much leveraged, and